subscribe.
Two pairs of grey denim trousers, 3 blue and white striped shirts, a grey flannel prison jacket, prison-issue woolen socks, boots and cotton underwear, communal bath once a week with yellow soap and a regulation short back and sides. A day that began at 6:30 a.m. with a bell clanging on the landing and ended when lights went out at 9:30 p.m. From the 5th of November 1956, a wet Friday when the gates of Wandsworth Jail closed behind the black prison van bringing the latest batch of prisoners down from the Central Criminal Court, this became the new life of Ronnie Kray. Nothing could have been further from the old life of drink and fights and easy money than the dingy monastery of Wandsworth Jail, nothing more at odds with the dream world the Colonel had built round the Eric Street Billiard Hall and Fort Valence. Yet he took to it surprisingly well. His mother worried that it would be terrible for him to be parted from his Reggie, but Reggie came in to see him on visits, and neither twin seemed unduly concerned at being apart. After the first day's gloom of settling in, the Colonel appeared very much his old self. This was partly because he had so many friends in prison that Wandsworth was something of a home from home, and although he was locked in a single cell on the ground floor of the main prison block after lights out, he had plenty of opportunity for renewing old acquaintances during the rest of the day. Next to him in the workshop, where he sat 5 hours of the day officially making brushes, was his one-time cellmate and comrade in arms, ex-Fusilier Dickie Morgan, currently serving a 4-year sentence for hijacking a lorry load of meat. The same day at exercise he met his boyhood friend Checker Berry, son of old Teddy Kid Berry, who gave him his first professional boxing lessons. The ordinary man who finds himself in prison gets his worst shock from the sudden contact with a jail world alien to life outside. For the professional criminal this is not so. His society is one that stretches both sides of the prison wall. There is liberty one side, restriction the other, but the gossip and friendships are there in common, and Ronnie Kray had much the same status among the small core of professional criminals in Wandsworth Jail that he had enjoyed in the Billiard Hall and Bethnal Green. The great majority of prisoners were beneath contempt. They were essentially straight people who had come unstuck, as Ronnie said, by pinching somebody's bicycle or fiddling the books at the local fish shop. He wasn't interested in such riffraff and they took good care not to get involved with him, but there were a few professionals in Wandsworth who regarded their spell away as an interlude in their normal way of life. These men had heard about the Colonel and his private returned prisoners' aid society. They knew that he had a brother outside who still commanded much power, and when their spell inside was over they knew how useful the friendship of a gang like the Krays could be. Soon life inside Wandsworth Jail was very cosily buttoned up. Reggie helped here. He had never shown himself more practical and efficient than when he set about organizing the well-being of his twin brother inside Wandsworth Jail. In theory, all prisoners are equal. Apart from the privileges they earn by hard work and good behavior, no extra food or comforts can be sent in, and what money they earn by prison work goes into an account at the canteen to be spent on sweets or extra tobacco. But no society is able to exist without a currency, even if a forbidden one. Once there is a currency, it can be manipulated to acquire privilege and power. The unofficial currency of every jail is tobacco, and Reggie Kray saw to it that his brother was tobacco rich from the day his sentence started. This was simple but required organization. The first move was for Ronnie to find a number of non-smoking married men serving their sentence with him who had families somewhere in London, then to suggest a deal. If they would supply him with their spare tobacco, he'd arrange for their wives to be put on the Kray pension scheme. An ounce of tobacco would rate a £1 note for the wife outside. Reggie made certain that the money was paid regularly each week. Once Ronnie had all the tobacco he needed, he began using it to build himself a life apart from the rest of prison society. In his own eyes, he remained someone extraordinary. Even in prison, he could adopt a lordly attitude towards the petty chores of servitude. There was the question of work. Canteen earnings were geared to the number of brushes turned out each day, and a straight prisoner soon learned the knack of managing the pitch and bristles and earning a reasonable wage. Ronnie never bothered. Straight work was even more contemptible within prison than out, and he would buy brushes off other men in the brush workshop to fill in his minimum quota by the end of the day. Similarly with food, whenever he considered the food below standard, particularly the fish, which is universally loathed in prison, Ronnie would just refuse it, filling up instead with cakes and biscuits bought from the canteen by one of his pensioners. So Ronnie kept his private dream alive during these first months in Wandsworth, turning his prison life into a replica of life outside. A fantasy can be lived anywhere. He had his Batman and his servants to look after him. He had his group of followers who talked about the villainy they'd start when they were free. He had his silences, his moods, his periods when people would whisper among themselves that the colonel was thinking and had best not be disturbed. Reggie survived the separation too. He missed Ronnie. Valence Road was a lonely place without him, and nobody could take his place within the firm. There didn't seem much point in doing things without the colonel there. Reggie was no substitute for his brother, but didn't try to be. Ronnie's great dream world vanished with him. No more vendettas, sudden shootings, wars to the death. Without the daily contact of his twin, Reggie calmed down. Suddenly he was free from the suspicions and fears that he had shared with Ronnie. Gradually it seemed that he relaxed, became more confident, and the old charm, which had been wearing thin, started to reappear. Now that he was head of the firm, he came into his own as leader and money-getter. Reg was the live wire and Ron was the lazy bastard. All that Ron wanted was the glory, but Reg was after anything that spelled money. I'd always felt that what the East End needed was a decent, properly run club of its own, so that the East End people could come and listen to some music and buy their women a drink without having to worry about some hooligan making trouble. Reggie had dreamt of this for years. The billiard hall and then the stragglers had given him a taste for playing host and meeting people. As long as Ronnie was around, any club of the twins would be restricted to a hardened clientele. With him away, Reggie had his chance. He took considerable trouble finding the right place before deciding on an empty shop along the Bow Road. It was completely derelict, but it was central and the rent was cheap. Reggie and two of the firm did the redecorating themselves, building a stage and putting up red flock wallpaper in the bar. All the ideas were Reggie's. He had never been happier than he was now, making this place entirely his own. A few months after Ronnie began his 3-year sentence, Reggie was putting on his brand new smoking jacket for the opening of the finest drinking club the East End's ever known. It was a success from the start. Reggie had a flair for knowing what people wanted and was smart enough to see that the new affluent East End needed a West End style club of its own. He soon proved that he had a real talent for club life. He said there would be no hooligans. The few who came were quickly dealt with. He said he wanted men to be able to bring their girlfriends. They did. Soon he had regulars who came because of him, and suddenly the club began to get known as one of the in places on the East End circuit for people from the West. The first few lesser-known celebrities started to arrive in the Bow Road, a playboy or two, an up-and-coming starlet, journalists, an occasional film man in search of new locations. For them, this was the authentic East End they were looking for. For Reggie, they were ambassadors of the good life and started him on a love affair with the famous, which the twins would share in the years ahead. The success was Reggie's, but Ronnie was not forgotten. The club combined their joint initials. Reggie called it the Double R. Unlike his brother, Reggie Kray had the makings of a first-rate businessman gangster of the old school. Without his brother, he would have made a definite success of crime and almost certainly have been a rich man and a free one today. During this time of freedom from his twin, Reggie took few risks, did nothing for the hell of it, and shrewdly chose to work with just a few rich semi-honest clients who needed him. He also showed that, without Ronnie there, he could hold on to his money. During this period with the Double R, As Reggie got established as a character and showed that he was thoroughly at home in the limbo land of crime and club life, he rationalized his criminal affairs. There was no need to grab at anything to bring in £50. Crime and the club life went together. He could confine himself to working with a few men at a time who could be thoroughly exploited. He found he had a talent for spotting them. They were the men with money and with something else: greed, boredom with a straight world, or weakness for dishonesty. According to Reggie, it's odd how you can pick them out at once. There's some rich people can't resist the idea of crime. You see them getting all worked up when they think they're with criminals. I suppose it's because they've always longed to do something forbidden, but they seem to get a kick like sex out of the idea of crime. The way it was developing, the Double R was the ideal place for meeting men like this. The corrupt moneyed world could mingle easily with the criminal one. Reggie began exploiting both of them. He could be vicious still when necessary. On the few occasions when there were fights at the Double R, he was as lethal as ever. He was still cunning too, and not the man to forget a grudge. Ronnie had to be avenged. A few months after Terry Martin went into the witness box at the Old Bailey, fire swept through the drinking club owned by the Martin family in Poplar. At the time it happened, Reggie was fishing with a policeman friend in Suffolk. He had always been good with alibis, and he was clever about the threats that sometimes came his way. These usually came from people he had tricked out of money. One day he heard that someone who had threatened him was trying to buy a gun from one of the East End's illicit arms dealers. He spoke to the dealer, who sold the man the gun he wanted, but it was a special one, so special that when the man waited outside the Double R and took a shot at Reggie as he left, it exploded in his hand. He was in hospital for nearly a month. Photographs of this period show Reggie smiling. The weariness has left his face. Despite the hours he was keeping, he looked fit and well. He kept himself in trim, drank moderately and lived a very normal life. He liked young children, enjoyed the country, began riding at weekends. Before long the Double R was bringing in a steady income, and it was clear that he had hit on the formula for success: the orderly raucousness, the sentimental Cockney songs of Queenie Watts, the villains mixing with celebrities, and the regular presence of several large but well-behaved old boxers like handsome Tommy Brown, the Bear of Tottenham, and Big Pat Connolly, the Glasgow doorman, who weighed 22 stone in his prime. Sometimes the gypsies came, and Reggie, remembering his own Romany blood, stood them all drinks and told them they could stay. He now had real celebrities among the Double R's visitors: Jackie Collins, Sybil Burton, Barbara Windsor. He called them by their first names and drew a certain glamour from their presence. He looked like turning into something of a playboy, dressing well, enjoying an evening in a West End nightclub and, for the first time in his life, taking an interest in women. This was the biggest break of all from Ronnie, who had always managed to keep him away from women. Bound by the ties that link a homosexual with his identical twin, Ronnie had always seen any show of interest in a girl as pure rebellion, which it was, and treated it accordingly. What you thinking of? Going with a bloody woman? You're getting soft. Don't you know that women smell and give you diseases? Now things were different without Ronnie there. Reggie realized he was good looking and that women found him attractive. Life at the Double R taught him what he had never understood before, that women are part of the good life and nothing to be ashamed of. Now for the first time Charlie Kray, the elder brother, really came into Reggie's life. He and his blonde wife, Dolly, fitted in naturally with the new life of the Double R. Reggie got on with him, although the relationship was different from the one he had with Ronnie. Charlie had nothing of Ronnie's viciousness or showmanship or dreams of glory. He was an easygoing man whose wife didn't get on with her in-laws, and so he had built a separate family life of his own with their 2 children in a modern flat in Stepney. He and his wife enjoyed themselves. He did well as a wardrobe dealer. They often had a night out in the West End together. Dolly danced well, and Charlie was something of a gambler, like his father. Now, with the Double R flourishing, Charlie Kray joined in the success. Had Ronnie been around, the money would have gone as fast as it was earned. The club would have become another battlefront, and Reggie's energy would soon have gone into fresh wars and further gang alliances. With Charlie there, things were different. Charlie was shrewd. They found another drinking club at Stratford and bought it. They began their own car site on the empty plot beside the billiard hall. Then Charlie heard of an empty house going for a nominal rent next to the car park of Bow Police Station. It was typical of Reggie to decide that this would be an ideal place for an illicit gambling club. Despite their neighbors, the Wellington Way Club, which they opened in the spring of 1957, became their biggest money spinner so far. Blackjack, rummy, and faro were bringing in a minimum of £50 a night in house money. The profits doubled when Reggie installed an illegal bookmaking business on the premises. Despite the close proximity of Bow Police Station, the only threat to the gathering enrichment of Reggie and Charlie Kray was not the law but the prisoner in Wandsworth Jail, who was just entering the 15th month of his sentence. Ronnie Kray seemed fine. Now that he had his own small world under control, he was quite happily sitting his sentence out and hoping for remission for good conduct. He was no trouble. He read a lot. Boys Town was still his favorite book. It's a lovely story. I used to dream of doing something like that for homeless boys when I came out. Not just because I liked boys either. I wanted to do some good. Something that I could be remembered for. He kept to himself, apart from his pensioners and a few close friends. The warders treated him warily. Reggie and the family wrote regularly, and he had made a new friend, a good-looking giant of a man called Frank Mitchell. Ronnie had been reading of Mice and Men. Mitchell reminded him of Lenny. He was a gentle psychopath, immensely strong, childlike with those he trusted, violent against authority. Warders kept clear of him, and although he had spent most of his life in institutions, he was proud of taking any punishment he got. Ronnie admired this. He admired his body and his looks. He also liked to feel that he could care for him. He would try to cheer him up during recreation. When Frank was depressed, Ronnie would send him presents of food and tobacco. Few people visited him, so Ronnie arranged with Reggie to get members of the firm to come in to see him. When they talked, Ronnie always promised Mitchell that he and his brother would look after him in the years ahead. Then overnight, Ronnie Kray's routine was broken. Without intending it, his good behavior had made him eligible for the easier life of a first offender's prison, and he found himself aboard the Solent ferry, bound for the Isle of Wight. The prison at Camp Hill was more humane than Wandsworth. There was a liberal-minded governor, prisoners mixed quite freely most of the day, and the whole prison staff made an attempt to teach these first offenders trades and stop them turning into hardened criminals. Ronnie hated it. There were too many games and far too many straight prisoners for his liking. In Wandsworth, the old lags respected him. He had prestige. Here he was nothing. The old Wandsworth tobacco circuit didn't operate. Instead of prisoners needing his help, most of these new ones kept clear of someone smelling so plainly of trouble. He was still shy, still vulnerable, and found it hard to start a normal friendship. All his relationships beyond the family had been with the weird, the cowed, or the small group of Bethnal Greeners he had grown up with. New friends appeared impossible. He was entirely alone here. His family and followers were a continent away across the Solent. He had no aptitude to learn a trade, and for the first time he sensed that he was losing touch with the one being who had always been his firm link with reality. Reggie's success obsessed him. Gradually he withdrew into himself. He gave up the effort of talking to people. He stopped writing letters and seemed to lose the power to read. All he could do was watch, and he gradually became convinced that everyone was hostile to him. In the past he had controlled events, now he was helpless. People had feared him, now they were getting their revenge. During the night he would lie awake for hours, brooding on what he'd seen, trying to work out what had happened to turn everyone against him. If Reggie had been there, I'd have been all right, but there was no one. I started thinking there was someone there all set to do me in. The worst thing was not knowing what he'd done. Then I worked out what was behind it all. I was a bit balmy now, but I thought that everyone was thinking I had grasped This explained everything: the silences, the lack of friends, the sudden isolation. But it was terrible. Ronnie had spent his life loathing the law. An informer was the lowest of the low. No one could seriously believe this of him. The suspicion turned to certainty. What other reason would a group of prisoners have for making him an outcast? He tried to face it calmly. If people thought like that, so what? He knew the truth. He had less than a year to serve. Then he'd be back among people who loved him and respected him. The year soon proved too long. I don't know what it was set me off, but I thought there were agents everywhere working a big plot out to torture me. His only hope was vigilance, never to trust a soul or give himself away. Somehow at night, he had to keep himself awake. His survival depended on it. He talked to no one, did nothing except concentrate on his battle to stay alive. People ignored him, but he knew they were watching. Then came the thought that finished him. Just suppose all his enemies were right. Suppose he had been an informer without knowing it. How could he prove he wasn't? If only Reggie had been there, he would have known. But on his own like this, how could he be sure of anything? Perhaps there was someone else inside him forcing him to do things he never knew. How could he know that he was Ronnie Kray at all? Hardly sleeping, barely eating for fear that someone might have poisoned his food. Ronnie spent most of each day huddled in his cell facing the door. The warders, worried that he might kill himself, kept him under observation, making him more nervous still. They noticed that the only time he moved was to go to the mirror. He spent hours on end watching himself. They thought it vanity. It wasn't. He was attempting to keep sane with the sight of the one familiar thing left, his own face. Even that was changing. There was a puffiness around the eyes, a faint thickening along the jawline. This was the point at which he broke. The watching game could last no longer. If they were all against him, he would face them and get it over with. That evening, instead of staying in his cell, he walked down to the recreation room. He stood apart from all the others, watching for a while. They were all enemies. He saw that now. They were pretending to ignore him with their silly games. But he had had enough. He began breathing deeply as he had done between rounds as a boxer to gain strength. He screamed, then charged, arms flailing, punching at everyone he could. He tipped a table over and hurt several prisoners before he was safely put into a straitjacket. Later that night he thought he saw the man who had been plotting everything against him from the start. The governor of Camp Hill Prison had heard of the trouble at recreation and called into the sick bay to see if prisoner Kray was feeling any better. "Filthy old bastard," screamed Ronnie, and spat at him. He felt better then. Ronnie was moved to the psychiatric wing of Winchester Jail for observation. The medical officer diagnosed an attack of prison psychosis, a term covering almost any form of violent mental disorder brought on by confinement, and had him heavily sedated. For a while, he seemed to recover. He answered questions coherently, was pleased with news of the family, and began eating again. Then came the news about Aunt Rose. The family had known that she had leukemia for nearly 2 years, but had kept it from Ronnie for fear of upsetting him. Wild Aunt Rose, who once beat 2 women in a straight fight in Valence Road, fought death as she had fought everyone. Twice she dragged herself home when the doctors had given her less than a year to live. When she was too weak to stand, the family refused to let her back into hospital. Violet insisted it wasn't right to allow our Rose to die in a place like that, so we took turns, sitting up with her every night. She was in the big bed in the front room where our mum and dad sleep now. The doctors warned us that her end would come with a hemorrhage and that it wouldn't be nice to see. Her feet swelled up and the rest of her went thin as a rake. Then on Christmas Eve the bleeding started. She went on Christmas Day. 2 days later, in the psychiatric wing of Winchester Jail, Ronnie received the letter from Reggie telling him that his Aunt Rose was dead. By evening he was incoherent and had to be placed in the straitjacket again for his own safety. Reggie had nightmares all that night. So did Violet Kray. She dreamt that 2 men in white coats were dragging Ronnie across a courtyard to a building without windows. The following morning she received an official telegram from the governor of Winchester Jail. "Your son Ronald Kray is certified as insane."
Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.